The blood-red sunset painted the Montana sky as Victor Mason rode slowly up the path to the homestead he once shared with his wife. The wooden house stood silhouetted against the dying light, just as it had every evening for the past 15 years, though for the past 3 months, no smoke had risen from the chimney to greet him upon his return. No laughter echoed from within.
No, Sara.
The spring of 1873 had taken her, sudden as a lightning strike. Pneumonia, the doctor had called it. Victor had watched helplessly as she withered in their bed, her breath growing shallow until one morning it didn't come at all. He'd buried her beneath the cottonwood tree where they'd exchanged their vows 17 years prior, when the territory was still wild and they were young and full of dreams. Victor dismounted his dappled gray, Stormy, and patted the horse's neck before leading him to the small stable. The routine was the same as always: remove the saddle, brush down the horse, provide fresh water and feed, but the heaviness in Victor's chest never lightened. When the stable work was done, he trudged toward the house, his spurs jingling with each step, the sound emphasizing the silence that awaited him inside. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots as he entered. The house felt cavernous and wrong without Sarah's presence. Her rocking chair sat empty by the hearth. Her quilts remained folded in the chest. Her dried herbs still hung from the kitchen rafters. "The house feels wrong," Victor whispered to the emptiness, hanging his hat on the peg by the door. "Then let's make it right." Victor's hand flew to the revolver at his hip, drawing it in one fluid motion as he spun toward the voice. His heart hammered against his ribs. Victoria Keller stood in the doorway to the kitchen, her hands raised slightly in a peaceful gesture. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a simple bun, and her traveling dress bore the dust of the trail. Her green eyes, so like the spring grass of the valley, regarded him steadily. "Miss Keller?" Victor lowered his gun slowly, disbelief flooding through him. "What in God's name are you doing here?" Victoria stepped forward, lowering her hands. "I received your letter, Mr. Mason. About Sarah. I came as soon as I could arrange passage." Victor holstered his weapon, the shock still evident on his weathered face. Victoria was Sarah's cousin from back east. They'd grown up together in Pennsylvania before Sarah had followed Victor west after the war. The two women had remained close through letters, though Victoria had visited only once, 10 years ago. "That was 3 months ago," Victor said, his voice rough with emotion. "And I didn't ask you to come." "No, you didn't." Victoria moved further into the room, her gaze taking in the dusty surfaces and the general air of neglect that had settled over the house. "But Sarah wrote to me regularly. Her last letter.
She was worried about you.
She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I would check on you." Victor turned away, unable to bear the sympathy in her eyes.
"I've managing fine."
The lie hung heavy between them. The unwashed dishes in the kitchen sink and the layer of dust on the furniture told another story entirely. "I can see that," Victoria said gently. "When was the last time you had a proper meal, Mr. Mason?" Victor didn't answer. He couldn't remember. Days blended together now. He worked the ranch from dawn till dusk, fell into bed exhausted, and rose to do it all again. Eating seemed an unnecessary complication. "I've made a stew," Victoria said, nodding toward the kitchen. "Nothing fancy, but it's hot. I hope you don't mind that I took the liberty." The aroma of beef and vegetables finally registered in Victor's consciousness. His stomach growled in response, reminding him that he'd eaten nothing since a piece of jerky at midday. "You shouldn't have troubled yourself," he said stiffly, but he found himself following her into the kitchen nonetheless. "It's no trouble," Victoria replied, ladling the steaming stew into a bowl. She placed it before him at the table along with a chunk of bread.
"Eat.
We can talk after." Victor sat heavily in the chair, suddenly aware of how bone-tired he truly was. He ate mechanically at first, then with growing appetite as the flavors awakened his senses. Victoria sat across from him, sipping a cup of coffee, watching him with those perceptive green eyes. "How long do you plan to stay?" he asked finally, pushing away his empty bowl. Victoria set down her cup. "I'm not certain. Long enough to help you put things in order, I suppose." Victor stiffened. "I don't need a nursemaid, Miss Keller." "Clearly," she replied, a hint of steel beneath her soft tone. "But Sarah would be heartbroken to see her home, the home you built together, in such a state. And you look as though you haven't slept properly in weeks." Victor wanted to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he asked, "Where are your things?" "At the hotel in town." I wasn't certain of my welcome. Victor ran a hand over his face, feeling the stubble of several days' growth. Sarah would have been ashamed of his inhospitality. "You're welcome to stay here. There's the guest room." Sarah always kept it ready for visitors. His voice caught on his wife's name. Victoria's expression softened. "Thank you. I'll fetch my things tomorrow." She stood and began clearing the dishes. "For tonight, I'll help you tidy up a bit before I head back to town." "That's not necessary," Victor protested. "Perhaps not," Victoria agreed, "but it's what I'm going to do all the same. Sarah was like a sister to me, Mr. Mason. Helping you is helping her in a way." Victor watched as Victoria moved efficiently around the kitchen, washing dishes and wiping down surfaces. She had Sarah's practical nature, though physically they were quite different. Where Sarah had been fair and delicate, Victoria was tall and strong-looking, with a quiet confidence in her movements. She had come west alone. Victor realized suddenly, no small feat for a woman. "How was your journey?" he asked, feeling obligated to make some conversation. Victoria glanced at him over her shoulder.
Long. Dusty.
"The train only takes you so far, as you know, and the stagecoach leaves much to be desired in terms of comfort. But the countryside is beautiful. I'd forgotten how vast everything is out here." Victor nodded. The vastness had been what drew him after the war. After 4 years of blood and confinement, and the press of too many bodies, he needed space to breathe. Sarah had understood that, had followed him without complaint to this remote corner of the Montana Territory. "Will you tell me about her last days?" Victoria asked quietly, her back still turned to him. Her letters stopped so suddenly. "I'd like to know." Victor's throat tightened. He hadn't spoken of Sarah's death to anyone except the preacher who'd said a few words at her burial. The ranch hands had attended the funeral, hat in hand, murmuring awkward condolences before drifting away to give him privacy in his grief. "It was quick," he said finally, the words scraping his throat. "Too quick." She had a cough that wouldn't go away. Then one night, she couldn't catch her breath. By morning she was burning with fever. "I rode for the doctor, but by the time we returned..." He couldn't finish. Victoria turned to face him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'm sorry I wasn't here. For both of you." Victor nodded, unable to speak further. He rose abruptly. "I should check on the horses once more before turning in." Victoria didn't try to stop him as he strode from the house, grateful for the cool night air against his hot face. He stood in the yard for a long while, looking up at the stars that had witnessed his happiness and now kept silent vigil over his grief. When he returned to the house an hour later, Victoria was gone, but the kitchen gleamed in the lamplight. Fresh coffee sat warming on the stove, and a note on the table informed him that she would return in the morning with her belongings. For the first time since Sarah's death, Victor slept through the night. True to her word, Victoria arrived the next morning just as Victor was finishing his chores. She came in a hired wagon, her trunks stacked in the back. Victor helped her unload, surprised at the weight of the largest one. "Books," Victoria explained, seeing his expression. "I couldn't bear to leave them behind." Victor nodded, remembering how Sarah had treasured the few volumes they owned. Reading had been a luxury on the frontier, especially in the early days. Over the next few days, a routine developed. Victor rose before dawn and tended to the outside work with his hired men, while Victoria brought order back to the house. She cleaned and aired out rooms, washed linens, and prepared meals that gradually reawakened Victor's appetite. They spoke little at first, both circling cautiously around the absence that loomed between them. A week into her stay, Victor returned from checking fence lines to find Victoria on her knees in Sarah's garden, pulling weeds from between the rows of vegetables that had grown wild in the months since his wife's death. "You don't have to do that," he said, dismounting and tying Stormy to the hitching post. Victoria looked up, pushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. "I know." But it seemed a shame to let all her work go to waste. She gestured to the plants. "There will be a good harvest of beans and squash if we tend it properly." Victor's chest tightened at the sight of another woman kneeling in Sarah's garden. It felt wrong somehow, as if he were betraying his wife's memory by allowing it. Victoria must have read something of his thoughts in his expression. She stood, brushing soil from her apron.
"I'm sorry."
"I should have asked first." "No," Victor said quickly. "It's fine." Sarah would have hated to see her garden neglected. She was always after me to help her weed it, but I never seemed to find the time. Victoria's smile was gentle. She complained about that in her letters. "She said you were more interested in cows than cucumbers." The unexpected memory startled a laugh from Victor, rusty from disuse. She wasn't wrong. Victoria's smile widened. No, she rarely was. She gestured to the house. "I've made lemonade if you're thirsty. And there's bread cooling on the windowsill." Victor realized he was indeed thirsty, and suddenly ravenous as well. "Thank you. I'll just see to Stormy first." As he led the horse to the stable, Victor found himself pondering the strangeness of the situation. A month ago, he'd been drowning in grief, barely functioning. Now he was laughing about cucumbers and looking forward to fresh bread. It felt like a betrayal, and yet, the house didn't feel quite so wrong anymore. Over the following weeks, Victoria's presence brought a gradual change to the ranch. The house came back to life under her care, and Victor found himself returning to it each evening with something approaching anticipation rather than dread. They settled into a comfortable rhythm, sharing meals and, increasingly, conversation. Victor learned that Victoria had worked as a schoolteacher in Pennsylvania until the death of her parents 2 years prior. She had no siblings and no husband, never met a man worth the trouble, she'd said with a wry smile that made Victor wonder about the story behind it. Victoria, in turn, asked about the ranch, about how Victor and Sarah had built their life in the West. She was a good listener, drawing him out with thoughtful questions that made him remember not just the hardships, but the joys as well. One evening in July, as they sat on the porch watching a summer thunderstorm roll across the valley, Victoria said, "You must have loved her very much." Victor nodded, his eyes on the distant lightning. "She was everything to me. The war. It changed me, made me hard in ways I didn't like. But Sarah always saw the good in me, even when I couldn't see it myself." Victoria was quiet for a moment.
"She wrote about that."
"About how proud she was of the life you'd built together. How grateful she was that you found peace here." Victor glanced at her, surprised. "She wrote that?"
"Yes."
Sarah wasn't one to complain, as you know. Even when things were difficult, she always focused on the blessings. Victoria hesitated. "She also wrote that she worried about what would become of you if anything happened to her. She said you'd withdraw into yourself, that you'd work yourself to exhaustion rather than face your grief." Victor looked away, discomfited by the accuracy of his wife's prediction. "Sarah always could read me like a book." "She loved you," Victoria said simply. "And she wanted you to be happy, no matter what happened." Victor didn't respond. The concept of happiness without Sarah seemed impossible, a betrayal of everything they'd shared. The storm moved closer, lightning illuminating the landscape in brilliant flashes. Thunder rumbled overhead. "We should go in," Victor said, rising. It's going to pour any minute. As if on cue, fat raindrops began to fall, quickly turning into a downpour. They hurried inside, laughing as they shook water from their clothes. I've always loved summer storms, Victoria said, gazing out the window at the rain-lashed yard. There's something cleansing about them. Victor watched her profile in the lamplight, struck suddenly by how at ease she seemed in Sarah's home. In their home. The thought should have disturbed him, but instead he found it strangely comforting. The rain continued through the night, a steady drumming on the roof that lulled Victor to sleep. He dreamed of Sarah, but for the first time since her death, the dream wasn't painful. She was smiling at him, standing in their garden, her hands dirty from planting. Take care of her, she said, though Victor didn't know who she meant. And let her take care of you. He woke to sunshine streaming through his window and the smell of coffee brewing. For a moment, he could almost believe that the past months had been the dream, that Sarah would be waiting for him in the kitchen. Reality returned with a hollow ache, but it was tempered somehow, less sharp than before. Victor dressed and made his way to the kitchen, where Victoria stood at the stove, her back to him. She was humming softly, a tune he didn't recognize. Good morning, he said, pouring himself coffee from the pot. Victoria turned with a smile. Good morning. Did you sleep well? That storm was something else. Better than I have in a while, Victor admitted, taking a seat at the table. What about you? Like a baby. There's nothing like the sound of rain on a roof to send me straight to sleep. She placed a plate of eggs and bacon before him. I was thinking of riding into town today, if that's all right. We're running low on flour and sugar, and I'd like to post a letter to my friend back east. Victor nodded, surprised at the disappointment he felt at the thought of spending the day without her company. Of course. Take Maybelle, she's gentle and good on the road. Thank you. Victoria sat across from him with her own plate. Is there anything you need from town? Victor thought for a moment. Tobacco, if you wouldn't mind. And perhaps some peppermint drops. Sarah always. He trailed off, realizing too late what he'd been about to say. Victoria's expression softened. Sarah always kept them in the jar by the door. I remember. She offered me one every time I came to visit. Victor nodded, grateful that she understood. That's right. They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the clink of cutlery against plates and the distant lowing of cattle from the pasture. When Victoria rose to clear the dishes, Victor found himself saying, I could ride with you if you like. Into town. Victoria looked surprised, then pleased. I'd like that. It's been a while since I've had a proper escort. Victor felt a warmth in his chest that he quickly attributed to the coffee. Give me an hour to check on the herd with the boys, and I'll be ready. The ride to town was pleasant, the summer day warm but not oppressive. Victor found himself pointing out landmarks to Victoria, the creek where he'd taught Sarah to fish, the stand of pines where they'd once sheltered from a sudden snowstorm, the ridge where they'd watched a meteor shower on their 10th anniversary. Victoria listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. You know this land so intimately, she observed as they crested a hill overlooking the small settlement that served as the nearest town. It's become part of you. Victor nodded, surveying the familiar landscape. When I came back from the war, I couldn't settle. Everything felt too small, too confined. But out here, he gestured to the vast expanse around them. Out here, a man can breathe, can make something of himself without the weight of the past pressing down on him. And you certainly have made something, Victoria said, admiration clear in her voice. Your ranch is thriving. You should be proud. Victor shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. We were lucky. The land is good, and we had a few mild winters to start. It's more than luck, Victoria insisted. It's hard work and determination. Sarah was always so proud of what you'd accomplished together. They rode into town, drawing curious glances from the locals. Victor wasn't a frequent visitor, and his appearance with a woman who wasn't his wife was certain to start tongues wagging. He found he didn't much care. They tied their horses at the general store, and Victor helped Victoria down from Mabel's back. His hands lingered at her waist perhaps a moment longer than necessary, and he stepped back quickly, unsettled by the realization. "I'll see to the supplies while you post your letter," he said gruffly. "Meet me here in an hour?" Victoria nodded, seemingly unperturbed by his sudden change in manner. "That sounds perfect. Thank you, Victor." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it in her voice stirred something within him that he wasn't ready to acknowledge. He tipped his hat and strode into the store, hoping the familiar task of selecting supplies would settle his thoughts. An hour later, they rode out of town laden with packages. Victoria had added several items to their original list: lengths of cloth, sewing notions, and a small box of watercolor paints that she'd shyly admitted were a luxury she'd missed. "I used to paint with my mother," she explained as they rode. "Nothing spectacular, just landscapes and the occasional portrait. It helps me think." Victor thought of the views from his land, the mountains in the distance, the sweep of prairie grass, the river that cut through the northern edge of his property. "There's plenty to paint out here." Victoria's smile was radiant. "Yes, I can see that. Perhaps I'll start with the garden. The sunflowers are just beginning to bloom." The mention of the garden reminded Victor of his dream, of Sarah's words. "Take care of her." He glanced at Victoria, her profile etched against the summer sky, and felt a surge of something that wasn't quite guilt, wasn't quite longing. Something in between. When they returned to the ranch, Victor helped Victoria unload their purchases. Their hands brushed as they passed packages back and forth, and each time, Victor felt a jolt of awareness that both disturbed and intrigued him. "Thank you for accompanying me today," Victoria said as they finished storing the last of the supplies. "It was much more enjoyable than going alone." "It was my pleasure," Victor replied, and was surprised to realize he meant it. The day away from the ranch, from the constant reminders of his loss, had been refreshing. Or perhaps it was simply Victoria's company that had lifted his spirits. The thought stopped him cold. What right did he have to find pleasure in another woman's company when Sarah had been gone barely 4 months? What kind of man was he, to be noticing the curve of Victoria's smile, the grace of her movements, the way sunlight caught in her auburn hair? "Victor? Is something wrong?" Victoria was looking at him with concern. He shook his head, unable to meet her eyes.
"No.
Just tired. I should check on the herd before dark." He left her standing in the kitchen, confusion evident on her face, and rode out to the pasture, where his cattle grazed. The physical exertion of riding helped clear his head, as did the simple task of counting cows and checking for any signs of trouble. By the time he returned to the house, dusk was falling and he'd reached a decision. Victoria's presence was becoming too complicated. It would be best for her to return east, where she belonged. He would tell her tomorrow. But when he entered the house, the words died in his throat. Victoria had prepared a special dinner: roast beef, potatoes, and apple pie for dessert. The table was set with Sarah's good china, and fresh wildflowers stood in a mason jar as a centerpiece. Victoria herself had changed from her riding clothes into a simple blue dress that brought out the green in her eyes. "I thought we might celebrate," she said, gesturing to the table. "Your birthday is next week, according to Sarah's letters, but I wasn't sure if you'd want to acknowledge it. So this is just a thank you for your hospitality and for today's adventure." Victor stood frozen in the doorway, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture and by the guilt that immediately followed his appreciation of it. Sarah had been the last person to prepare a special meal for him, to care enough about his birthday to mark the occasion. Victoria's smile faltered at his silence. "I'm sorry if I've overstepped. I just thought—" "No," Victor said quickly, forcing himself to step fully into the room. "No, you haven't overstepped. This is very kind of you. Thank you." The relief on Victoria's face, made his chest tighten. He washed up quickly and joined her at the table, determined to show proper gratitude for her efforts. The food was delicious, the company pleasant, and despite his earlier resolution, Victor found himself relaxing as the meal progressed. "Tell me about your plans," he said as they lingered over pie and coffee. "Will you return to teaching when you go back east?" Victoria set down her fork, her expression turning thoughtful. "I'm not certain I will go back east, actually."
Victor stared at her, surprised.
"But your life is there. Your friends, your home." "My house is there," Victoria corrected gently. "But it hasn't felt like home since my parents died. And while I have friends, there's nothing truly holding me in Pennsylvania." She hesitated. "I've been thinking of staying in the West, perhaps in town, or one of the larger settlements nearby. They're always in need of teachers." Victor didn't know how to respond. The thought of Victoria remaining in the territory both alarmed and pleased him. "It's a hard life out here," he said finally, "especially for a woman alone." Victoria's smile held a hint of challenge. "I'm stronger than I look, Mr. Mason. And I've managed on my own for quite some time now." The formal address was deliberate. Victor knew, a reminder of the proper distance between them. Yet even as she said it, her eyes held his with an intensity that belied her words. "Besides," she continued, breaking the moment, "I've grown fond of the open spaces, just as you said. There's a freedom here that I never found back east." Victor nodded, understanding completely. It was what had drawn him west after the war, what had kept him here through drought and blizzard and loneliness. But he'd had Sarah by his side. Victoria would be alone. "If that's what you decide," he said carefully, "I'd be happy to help you get established. Find a suitable place. Introduce you to people who might help." "Thank you," Victoria said, her expression softening. "That's very kind. But I haven't decided anything yet. It's just something I'm considering." The conversation turned to other topics, but Victor found his thoughts returning to Victoria's words. The possibility of her remaining in the territory changed things, though he wasn't sure exactly how. Would they remain in contact? Would she visit the ranch occasionally? The prospect stirred complicated emotions that Victor wasn't ready to examine too closely. After dinner, they moved to the porch to enjoy the cool evening air. The sky was a tapestry of stars, the Milky Way a bright swath against the darkness. Crickets chirped in the grass, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate. "It's so beautiful," Victoria said softly, her face upturned to the stars. "I'd forgotten how bright they are out here, away from city lights." Victor murmured agreement, though his gaze had drifted to her profile. In the starlight, she looked ethereal, untouchable. Yet she was very much of this earth, practical, strong, resilient in the face of loss, just as he had tried to be. "Victoria," he said, surprising himself with the use of her given name, "I want to thank you for coming here, for helping put things in order. The house. It doesn't feel as wrong anymore." She turned to look at him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he hadn't seen before.
"I'm glad."
Sarah loved this place so much. She wouldn't want it or you to be neglected. "No, she wouldn't," Victor agreed. "She was always the practical one between us. Always looking ahead while I was stuck in the past." Victoria hesitated, then said carefully, "It's not wrong, you know. To keep living. To find joy again. Sarah would understand that better than anyone." Victor looked away, unable to bear the gentleness in her eyes. "It feels like a betrayal." "It isn't," Victoria said firmly. "The greatest betrayal would be to let grief consume you, to waste the life she helped you build. Sarah didn't love you because you were perfect, Victor. She loved you because you were human, with all the messiness that entails, including grief and eventually healing." Her words struck a chord deep within him, resonating with truths he'd been avoiding for months. Sarah had always been practical about death. It was the way of things on the frontier. How many times had she said, after the passing of a neighbor or friend, "Life goes on, Victor. It has to." He turned back to Victoria, seeing her clearly for the first time, not as an intrusion or a reminder of what he'd lost, but as a person in her own right. A woman with her own griefs and hopes, who had traveled across the country because of a promise to her cousin. "How is it you're so wise?" he asked, only half joking. Victoria's laugh was soft. "I'm not wise, just experienced in loss. And fortunate enough to have had good examples in my parents, who taught me that love doesn't diminish when shared. It grows." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that neither was quite ready to acknowledge. Victor cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the intimacy of the moment. "It's getting late," he said, rising from his chair. "And tomorrow's an early start." Victoria nodded, accepting the shift in mood. "Of course. Good night, Victor. And thank you for today." He watched her disappear into the house, then turned back to the stars, his thoughts a tangled mess of guilt and longing. Sarah's absence was still a physical ache, a hole in his life that nothing could fill. And yet, the house didn't feel wrong anymore. And that, Victor realized with a start, was what truly frightened him. August brought scorching days and the beginning of harvest preparations. Victoria continued to tend Sarah's garden, bringing in beans, squash, and tomatoes that she preserved for the coming winter. Victor found himself spending more time at the house during daylight hours, ostensibly to repair things that had been neglected during his months of grief, but increasingly because he enjoyed Victoria's company. They settled into a comfortable routine, sharing meals and conversation, working side by side on household tasks in the evenings. Victor began telling stories of his and Sarah's early days on the ranch, finding that speaking of her eased the pain rather than sharpening it. Victoria, in turn, shared memories of her childhood with Sarah in Pennsylvania, painting a picture of his wife as a young girl that he'd never fully understood before. One evening, as they sat shelling peas on the porch, Victoria said, "Sarah once told me that the greatest gift you gave her was the freedom to be herself. She said that back east, she always felt constrained by expectations, but here, with you, she could simply be Sarah." Victor smiled at the memory. She was different out here, stronger, more confident. The first year was harder than anything she'd faced before. But she never complained, never asked to go back.
His voice softened.
"I asked her once, during that first winter when the snow was piled higher than the windowsills and we were down to our last sack of beans, if she regretted coming west. She looked at me like I was speaking Chinese and said, 'My place is with you, Victor Mason. In paradise or purgatory, it makes no difference.'" Victoria's eyes were bright with tears. "That sounds like Sarah. Loyal to the bone." Victor nodded, his own throat tight. "She was the best of women. I didn't deserve her." "She didn't think so," Victoria said gently. "And her opinion on the matter carries more weight than yours, I'd say." This startled a laugh from Victor. "You're probably right about that." They worked in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the snap of pea pods and the distant lowing of cattle. "I've been thinking," Victor said finally, keeping his eyes on his task, "about what you said about staying in the West. Teaching." Victoria glanced at him, her hands pausing briefly. "Yes, the town could use a good teacher. The current schoolmaster is planning to retire come spring, from what I hear. But there's no proper housing for a single woman." Victor hesitated, then plunged ahead. "You could stay here, on the ranch, until you find a suitable place." Victoria's expression was unreadable. "That's very generous of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Victor said quickly. "The house is too big for just me and—" He trailed off, uncertain how to express the growing realization that he didn't want her to leave. "And," Victoria prompted softly. Victor met her gaze directly. And I've grown accustomed to your company. The house feels less wrong with you in it. Color rose in Victoria's cheeks, but she held his gaze. I've enjoyed being here, she admitted. More than I expected to. But I wouldn't want to complicate things. Victor understood her concern. They'd been careful to maintain a proper distance, to keep their relationship firmly in the bounds of friendship and family connection. But he wasn't blind to the current that ran beneath their interactions, the awareness that had grown between them over the summer months. Nothing has to change, he said, though even as he spoke, he wondered if that was true. If it was even possible. Victoria seemed to read his thoughts. Everything changes, Victor. It's the nature of life. She set aside her bowl of peas and turned to face him fully. I care for you. More than I should, perhaps, given the circumstances. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel something for me as well. The directness of her words left him momentarily speechless. It was so like her, practical, honest, unafraid to name things as they were. I do, he admitted finally. And it feels like a betrayal. Of Sarah, of the life we built. Victoria's expression softened. I understand.
Truly, Ida.
But I also know that Sarah wouldn't want you to be alone. She loved you too much for that. Victor remembered his dream Sarah in the garden, telling him to take care of Victoria, to let her take care of him. Had it merely been his subconscious working through his grief, or something more? I need time, he said honestly, to be sure that what I'm feeling is real and not just gratitude or loneliness. Victoria nodded, accepting his words without offense. Of course. And I should be sure as well. This place, this ranch, it was Sarah's home first. I wouldn't want to replace her. You couldn't, Victor said, more sharply than he intended. Then more gently. No one could replace Sarah. But that doesn't mean there isn't room for. He struggled for the right word. For something new. Something different. Victoria's smile was gentle. Something new, she echoed. I like that. She rose, gathering her bowl of shelled peas. I should start dinner. And you should check on that fence in the north pasture before dark. Victor nodded, grateful for the return to practicality. I won't be long. As he rode out to the pasture, Victor's thoughts were a jumble of conflicting emotions. The guilt was still there, the sense that he was betraying Sarah's memory by feeling anything for her cousin. But alongside it was a growing certainty that Sarah, of all people, would understand. She had never been possessive or jealous in life. Why would she be in death? The north fence was intact, needing only minor repairs that could wait until morning. Victor lingered anyway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah had loved this time of day, when the harsh sunlight softened and the world seemed to pause between day and night. What should I do, Sarah? He asked aloud, feeling foolish but needing to say the words. Is it too soon? Is it wrong to feel this way? Only the whispering grass answered him, but as he turned stormy toward home, Victor felt a sense of peace settle over him. No revelation, no clear answer, but a quiet certainty that he was moving in the right direction. The house was warm and bright when he returned, the smell of beef stew and fresh bread filling the air. Victoria greeted him with a smile that held no expectation, no pressure, just the same warmth and welcome she'd offered since her arrival. They ate dinner and spent the evening as they had dozens of others, talking about the day's work, planning for tomorrow, comfortable in each other's company. But there was a new awareness between them, an acknowledgement of possibilities that hadn't existed or at least hadn't been recognized before. As August gave way to September, the first hints of autumn touched the valley. The days remained warm, but the nights carried a chill that hinted at the winter to come. Victor and Victoria continued their careful dance, neither pushing for more than the other was ready to give, but both acutely aware of the growing connection between them. Victoria began spending more time in town, making connections and learning about the teaching position that would open in the spring. The townspeople welcomed her, drawn to her warmth and genuine interest in their community. Several families with school-aged children invited her to dinner, eager to assess the woman who might teach their children. Victor found himself missing her during these absences, the house once again feeling wrong without her presence. He threw himself into harvest preparations, working alongside his ranch hands from dawn until dusk, exhausting himself physically in the hopes of quieting his mind. One evening in late September, Victoria returned from town later than expected, her expression troubled. Victor, who had been watching for her from the porch, immediately sensed that something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, taking the reins of her horse as she dismounted. Victoria shook her head, her usual composure visibly strained. "Nothing serious. Just people talking." Victor's jaw tightened. "About you? About us?" Victoria nodded, avoiding his gaze. "Apparently, it's quite the scandal. Sarah's cousin moving in with her widowed husband. The pastor's wife was particularly concerned about my moral welfare." Anger flared in Victor's chest. "It's none of their business. Your family, here at Sarah's request. There's nothing improper about it." Victoria's smile was sad. "We both know it's not quite that simple, Victor. And they're not entirely wrong to talk. A single woman living with a widower with no chaperone. It's not conventional." Victor ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "Since when have either of us cared about convention? This is the frontier, for God's sake. People make their own rules out here." "To a point," Victoria countered. "But even on the frontier, certain standards apply. Especially to women." She touched his arm gently. "I think perhaps I should find other accommodations. Mrs. Prescott has a room to let above her millinery shop." "No," Victor said firmly. "I won't have you driven out by gossip. This is your home for as long as you want it to be." The words hung between them, laden with meaning that went beyond the immediate issue of town gossip. Victoria's eyes searched his, looking for something that Victor wasn't sure he was ready to give. "What are we doing, Victor?" she asked softly. "What is this becoming?" It was the question he'd been asking himself for weeks, the one he still didn't have a clear answer to. But looking at Victoria now, her face flushed from the ride and her eyes bright with emotion, Victor knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. "I don't know," he admitted. "All I know is that when you're here, the house feels right again. When you're gone, I count the hours until you return. And I think Sarah would understand that." Victoria's expression softened. "I think she would too. She loved you enough to want your happiness, whatever form it might take." Victor took her hand, a gesture that felt both terrifying and right. "I'm not ready to put a name to this, to make promises. But I know I don't want you to leave." Victoria squeezed his hand, her touch warm and reassuring. "Then I'll stay, and we'll face the gossips together." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge, Victor felt a shift in the air between them. Nothing dramatic, nothing that could be pointed to as a definitive change, but a settling, a mutual acknowledgement of the path they were on. "Tell me about your parents," he said, wanting to know more about the woman beside him, the family that had shaped her. Victoria smiled, her expression softening with memory. "My father was a clockmaker. The most precise, methodical man you'd ever meet. Everything in its place, everything on schedule, except when it came to my mother. For her, he'd throw all his careful plans to the wind." "And your mother?" "A dreamer, an artist. She saw beauty everywhere, even in the grimiest corners of our town. They were complete opposites in temperament, but somehow perfectly matched." Victoria's voice grew wistful. "I remember asking her once how she knew my father was the right one. She said, 'When I'm with him, I'm more myself than when I'm alone.' I didn't understand what she meant until much later." Victor thought about Sarah, about how she had brought out the best in him, challenged him to be better than he was. And he thought about Victoria, How in her presence he felt not the need to be something he wasn't, but the freedom to be exactly who he was: grief, guilt, hope, and all. Your mother was a wise woman, he said.
Victoria nodded.
She was. I miss her still, every day. But the missing, it changes, becomes less raw, more a part of you, like a scar that still aches sometimes but doesn't bleed anymore. It was the most accurate description of grief that Victor had ever heard, and it resonated deeply with his own experience. The pain of Sarah's loss was still there, but it had transformed from a gaping wound to something he could carry without being crushed by it. Does it bother you? He asked suddenly. Living in Sarah's home, using her things? It must be strange. Victoria considered the question thoughtfully. Sometimes. At first, it felt like I was intruding in a space that wasn't mine. But then I remembered how Sarah always made guests feel that her home was their home. How generous she was with everything she had.
She paused.
I think she would be glad to know her home was still being cared for, still filled with life. Victor nodded, finding comfort in the thought. She hated waste. Used to drive me crazy with her insistence on saving every scrap of fabric, every leftover bit of food. He smiled at the memory. The first winter was lean, but we never went hungry because Sarah had preserved every berry and vegetable the garden produced. Victoria laughed softly. That sounds like her. Sarah could stretch a penny further than anyone I've ever known. They continued sharing memories of Sarah, finding joy in the recollection rather than pain. And as the night deepened around them, Victor realized that this was healing, not forgetting, not replacing, but incorporating his loss into a new understanding of life. The weeks passed, and autumn painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson. Victor and Victoria settled deeper into their shared life, their relationship evolving in small, careful steps. A touch of hands while passing dishes at dinner. A shared smile across a room. Conversations that stretched late into the night, revealing hopes and fears and dreams. The gossip in town continued, but its power to wound diminished as they faced it together. Victoria won over many of the skeptics with her genuine warmth and her obvious respect for Sarah's memory. She spoke of her cousin often and openly, making it clear that she had no intention of erasing Sarah from the ranch or from Victor's life. October brought the first frost, silvering the grass and painting delicate patterns on the windows. Victor woke early, as was his habit, and moved quietly through the house to avoid waking Victoria. He built up the fire in the kitchen stove and put coffee on to boil, then stood at the window watching the sun rise over the frosted landscape. The ranch looked different in autumn, the vibrant greens of summer giving way to the more subdued palette of fall. Different, but no less beautiful. Like his life now, Victor thought. Transformed by loss, but still holding beauty and possibility. He heard Victoria's step behind him and turned, offering a smile.
Morning.
Coffee's almost ready. She returned the smile, her hair loose around her shoulders in a way he'd rarely seen it. It's beautiful, she said, nodding toward the window. The frost. Like the world's been dusted with diamond dust. Victor nodded, struck once again by her ability to find beauty in the simplest things. It reminded him of Sarah, though the resemblance ended there. Victoria was entirely her own person, more forthright than Sarah had been, more willing to speak her mind, less concerned with smoothing over conflicts. I was thinking, Victor said, pouring coffee for them both, about taking a trip to Helena next month. I need to arrange for winter supplies, and there are some tools that can only be had in the city. He hesitated. Would you like to come? It would be a chance to see more of the territory, and Helena has a proper bookstore, I'm told. Victoria's face lit up. I'd love to. I've heard so much about Helena, but never had the chance to visit. It's settled then, Victor said, pleased by her enthusiasm. We'll go the second week of November, before the mountain passes get too treacherous. The prospect of the journey gave them both something to look forward to as they completed the final harvest tasks and prepared the ranch for winter. The garden was put to bed for the season, the last vegetables preserved in jars that lined the pantry shelves. The cattle were moved to the lower pastures, where they would be easier to feed and monitor during the snows. The barn was stacked with hay, and firewood was split and stacked against the house. Through it all, Victor and Victoria worked as a team, their movements around each other becoming more natural, more attuned. Victor found himself watching her when she wasn't looking the graceful efficiency of her movements, the way she hummed under her breath when concentrating on a task, the smile that transformed her face when something pleased her. He was falling in love with her. Victor realized one evening as they sat by the fire, Victoria reading aloud from a book of poetry while he cleaned his rifle. The knowledge didn't come as a shock, but as a quiet recognition of something that had been true for some time. The guilt he'd expected to feel was there, but muted, overshadowed by a sense of rightness that he couldn't deny. Sarah would understand, he thought. Sarah, who had always pushed him to live fully, to embrace joy wherever he found it. Sarah, who had loved Victoria like a sister and had trusted her enough to extract a promise of care. "What are you thinking about?" Victoria asked, looking up from her book. "You have the most serious expression." Victor set aside his rifle, considering his answer carefully. "About change," he said finally. "About how life rarely goes as planned, but sometimes the unexpected path leads to places you never thought you'd find again." Victoria closed her book, her expression thoughtful. "And is this unexpected path leading somewhere good, do you think?" Victor met her gaze steadily. "I think it might be, if we're brave enough to follow it." The words hung between them, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been growing for months. Victoria's cheeks flushed, but she didn't look away. "I've never considered myself particularly brave," she said softly. "But I find that with you, I want to be." Victor rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling before her. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he took her hand in his. "Victoria Keller, I never expected to feel this way again. Never wanted to, if I'm honest. But you've brought light back into this house, into my life, in a way I didn't think was possible." Victoria's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Victor, let me finish," he said gently. "I'm not asking for promises yet. I know it's soon and complicated, and there's still grief in both our hearts. But I want you to know that when I think about the future now, you're in it. And that's not something I could have imagined 6 months ago." A tear slipped down Victoria's cheek. "When I came here, all I wanted was to honor my promise to Sarah, to help you through the worst of your grief, and then return to my life. I never expected." She squeezed his hand. "I never expected to find a home here. With you." Victor brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. It was their first real acknowledgement of the feelings between them, the first step across a line they'd been approaching for months. Simple as it was, the gesture felt momentous, a commitment that went beyond words. "The house feels right with you in it," he said simply. "You make it right." Victoria smiled through her tears. "Then let's make it right together." The journey to Helena in November marked a turning point in their relationship. Away from the ranch and the ghost of Sarah that still lingered there, Victor and Victoria were free to explore their growing feelings without the weight of the past pressing quite so heavily upon them. Helena was a revelation to Victoria, who had never seen a frontier city in its prime. The wide streets bustled with activity miners from the surrounding hills, ranchers in for supplies, ladies in fashionable dress parading before the shops. They stayed at a respectable hotel, in separate rooms as propriety demanded, but spent their days together exploring the city. Victor conducted his business efficiently, arranging for supplies to be delivered to the ranch before the heavy snows came. Victoria visited the bookstore, returning with a stack of volumes that made Victor laugh and ask if she intended to read through the entire winter. Perhaps, she replied with a smile. There's not much else to do when the snow is piled to the windowsills, is there? On their last evening in Helena, Victor took Victoria to dinner at the finest restaurant in the city. She wore her best dress, a deep green that brought out the color of her eyes, and Victor found himself unable to look away from her throughout the meal. "You're staring," she said, a blush rising in her cheeks. "You're beautiful," he replied simply. "And I'm a fortunate man to be sitting across from you." Victoria's blush deepened. "Careful, Mr. Mason. People will talk." Victor laughed. "Let them. I find I care less and less about what people think." After dinner, they walked back to their hotel through streets lit by gaslight. The air was crisp with approaching winter, but not uncomfortably cold. On impulse, Victor took Victoria's hand, tucking it into the crook of his arm. "I've been thinking," he said, his breath forming clouds in the night air, "about the future."
About us.
Victoria glanced at him, her expression carefully neutral. "Oh, I want to court you properly," Victor said, the words coming out in a rush. "When we return to the ranch. If you're amenable, that is." Victoria's smile was like sunrise. "I'm amenable," she said softly. "Very much so." Victor felt a weight lift from his shoulders. "It won't be easy. People will talk even more than they do now. And there's still—" He hesitated. "There's still Sarah. Her memory." "Sarah will always be part of your life, Victor," Victoria said gently. "Just as my parents will always be part of mine. Love doesn't erase the past, it builds upon it." She squeezed his arm. "And as for people talking, let them. We know the truth of our hearts." They returned to the ranch 2 days later to find the first real snow of the season falling gently across the valley. The house welcomed them, warm and solid against the approaching winter, no longer a shrine to grief, but a home coming back to life. As December arrived, bringing with it the full force of winter, Victor and Victoria settled into a new phase of their relationship. True to his word, Victor courted her properly, bringing small gifts when he returned from trips to town, reading aloud to her in the evenings, taking her on sleigh rides across the snow-covered ranch. Their first kiss came on Christmas Eve, beneath a sprig of mistletoe that Victor had secretly hung in the doorway between the kitchen and the sitting room. It was gentle and tentative at first, then deepening as they both gave themselves permission to express the feelings that had been growing for months. When they finally drew apart, Victor rested his forehead against hers, his heart thundering in his chest. "I love you," he said simply. "I didn't think I'd ever say those words to anyone again, but I love you, Victoria Keller." Victoria's eyes shone with answering emotion. "And I love you, Victor Mason, with all my heart." That night, as snow fell silently outside and the house creaked and settled around them, Victor felt truly at peace for the first time since Sarah's death. The grief was still there, a quiet presence that would never fully leave him, but alongside it now was joy, hope, and the promise of a future he hadn't dared to imagine. Winter passed in a gentle rhythm of days spent in shared work and evenings by the fire. Victoria continued to prepare for her teaching position, which would begin in the spring, while Victor managed the ranch through the challenges of winter. They grew closer with each passing day, learning each other's habits, preferences, and moods, building the foundation of a life together. As March brought the first hints of thaw, Victor rode into town one afternoon and returned with a small package that he kept carefully hidden from Victoria. That evening, after dinner, he asked her to join him on the porch despite the lingering chill in the air. The sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold. Victor took Victoria's hands in his expression serious. "A year ago," he began, "I thought my life was over. When I buried Sarah, I buried my heart with her, or so I believed. I couldn't imagine finding joy again, or love, or purpose beyond simple survival." He squeezed her hands. Then you came, with your quiet strength and your stubborn insistence that the house could be right again. That I could be right again. Victoria's eyes filled with tears. Victor, let me finish, he said gently, echoing his words from months before. You've brought light back into my life, Victoria. You've helped me honor Sarah's memory while still finding room for new joy, new love. He released her hands to reach into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet box. I can't imagine my future without you in it. Will you marry me, Victoria? Will you make this house truly right again, as my wife? Victoria's tears spilled over, but her smile was radiant. Yes, she whispered. Oh, yes, Victor. Nothing would make me happier. He opened the box to reveal a simple ring with a small pearl surrounded by tiny diamonds. It's not grand, he apologized, but the pearl reminded me of you, luminous, formed through patience and endurance. It's perfect, Victoria said as he slipped it onto her finger. Absolutely perfect. Their wedding took place in May, beneath the cottonwood tree where Sarah was buried. It was Victoria's suggestion, a way to honor the woman who had brought them together, to include her in the beginning of their new life. Are you certain? Victor had asked when she proposed the location. It's unconventional. Victoria had smiled, touching his cheek gently. When have either of us cared about convention? And it feels right, doesn't it? To acknowledge that Sarah will always be part of our story, that without her, we wouldn't have found each other. So they stood beneath the cottonwood's spreading branches, with the preacher and a small gathering of friends as witnesses. Victoria wore a simple dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair. Victor, in his best suit, felt a curious mixture of joy and nostalgia as he spoke his vows, promising to love and cherish Victoria for all the days of their life together. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, a breeze stirred the cottonwood's leaves, showering them with delicate white fluff that danced in the air like snow. Victor felt a sense of peace settle over him, a certainty that Sarah was with them, giving her blessing. That evening, as they stood on the porch of their home, truly theirs now, shaped by both their hands, Victor put his arm around his new wife and gazed out at the ranch that had seen both his greatest sorrow and his unexpected joy. The house feels right, he said softly. You've made it right again. Victoria leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. We made it right, together, and we'll keep making it right every day. As the years passed, the ranch prospered, and so did the Mason family. Victoria continued to teach in town, riding in each morning and returning each afternoon, except during the harshest winter months when she taught the neighboring children in their own home. Victor expanded the ranch operations, breeding horses as well as cattle, gaining a reputation for fair dealing and quality stock. Their first child, a daughter they named Sarah Elizabeth, was born a year after their wedding. She had Victoria's auburn hair and Victor's blue eyes, and from her earliest days showed the same love for the land that had drawn both her parents to the West. 2 years later, a son joined the family, James Victor, sturdy and serious from the start, with his father's quiet determination. The house that had once felt so wrong to Victor became the center of a busy, joyful life. Laughter echoed through rooms that had known silence and grief. Children's toys scattered across floors that had been empty, and each night, Victor and Victoria sat on the porch, watching the sunset and counting their blessings. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, as they sat together after the children were asleep, Victor took his wife's hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. I never thought I would be happy again, he said quietly. After Sarah died, I couldn't imagine it. You gave me back the future, Victoria. You made this house a home again. Victoria leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. We did it together, she corrected gently. You were brave enough to open your heart again, to take a chance on love despite your loss. That's no small thing, Victor. He nodded, acknowledging the truth of her words. It had taken courage to love again, to risk the pain of potential loss. But the reward this life, this family, this love had been worth every moment of doubt and fear. "Do you think she knows?" he asked softly, looking toward the cottonwood tree visible in the moonlight. "Do you think Sarah knows we're happy?" Victoria followed his gaze, her expression thoughtful. "I think she does. I think she knew, even then, that we would find our way to this." She squeezed his hand. "She loved you enough to want your happiness above all else. And she loved me enough to trust me with your heart." Victor nodded, feeling the rightness of her words settle in his chest. The grief of losing Sarah would always be part of him, a shadow that occasionally fell across even the brightest days. But it no longer defined him or constrained his ability to love and be loved. The house that had once felt wrong now felt perfectly right, filled with memories both sad and joyful, with the voices of the past and the laughter of the future. Together, Victor and Victoria had made it right again, creating a home where love endured through all seasons, where loss was honored but not permitted to overshadow joy, where the frontier spirit of resilience and hope continued to thrive. As the moon rose higher over the Montana Valley, casting silver light across the land they both loved, Victor and Victoria Mason sat hand in hand, grateful for the unexpected path that had brought them together and for the courage to follow it into a future neither had imagined, but both now embraced with full hearts.